Well, welcome to the Dr. DigiPol show. I am Alan Rosenblatt, aka Dr. DigiPol, your host. We have a really good show for you today. My guest speaker is off getting a pair of headphones, and he'll be right back. But in the meantime, let me say to give you a little background on what we're going to be talking about. Black, who is a online offline organizing strategist. His specialty is figuring out that blurred line between online and offline advocacy, and he's a bit of a provocateur. He's been working with a bunch of projects, starting back in 2011, not the beginning of his career, but he was one of the original group of people that helped launch the Occupy Wall Street movement. And we'll talk a little bit about that. More recently, he was tapped to do some rapid response events for the DNC in the last 2016 election. And he's been doing a lot of really interesting things focusing on the intersection of large social media communities and political activism. So we're going to be really excited to have him back as soon as I see him back on the on the screen. I'll bring him up. But in the up there, I see him walking around, and I'm gonna bring him up on stage right now. Here comes my guest, Aaron Black. Aaron, welcome. Glad to see you found headphones and everything.
Thanks for having me.
So these are strange times we seem to be living in, aren't they?
You think?
I think. So you've been in the thick of electoral politics and progressive movement for quite some time. Why don't you just let's before we get into specifics, tell us a little bit about how you see your role in all of this.
Well, I don't know if it's I see my role. I think it's about um, how everybody else sees my role. I'm just here organizing. First and foremost, I think before you change laws, you got to control the narrative. You got to start out with controlling the message. A lot of that has to do with being able to connect with people on social media and then get that to translate to action on the ground, and then hopefully, uh, you know, boot people out of office that are more concerned about pleasing their donors as opposed to their constituents. You know the drill. We
Yeah.
need these guys to we need these guys to represent us as opposed to their corporate donors. And as you're well aware, the swamp and replenished more so than it ever has been before. So we got a big fight on our hands.
Yeah. So, despite all the rhetoric during the campaign of, I'll be the people's candidate, we seem to be seeing more and more, even more Wall Street representation in the Trump administration than in probably any other administration we've seen in quite some time. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the early days of the Occupy Wall Street movement. You were a little bit involved there, and tell us what kind of stuff you did,
Just a little bit.
and how that transpired and what you were trying to make happen.
Well, first of all, we never ever assumed that it was going to blow up like that. Um, Ultimately, we just wanted to get a little attention for our issue. Nobody was talking about economic and income inequality. Uh, we just thought that we would go down there, probably spend a few hours, maybe try to spend the night, and uh, then we'd all get arrested, and that'd be the end of that. And we ended up staying for a couple of months, but um, it wasn't it wasn't as organic in terms of how it was organized as most people think it was. The participation was completely organic, and that's the most important thing. Is it was something that was for the people. The organizers, like myself, we wanted everybody to own it, but um, you know, the bottom line is no one's going to participate in something unless they feel like they have some ownership. So we wanted to steer away from that whole top-down process, and we wanted to give it to the people. But still, it had to be organized by a few folks, and there weren't many. I mean, just a handful. A handful of people who were you know organizing those bank protests down at Chase and Citibank, and coordinating a lot of the on the ground action. And of course, there was that social media link that we had. And prior to Occupy Wall Street, there had never really been um, a coordinated direct action social media um, uh, event or series of events like this. And the thing about Occupy Wall Street, the reason why it stuck and it moved the way it did was it was continuous. It was repeat, repeat, repeat. You're not going to do anything by just having one event. If the Women's March ends up being one march and that's it, then it's over. That's not. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, those folks are organizing and think they're going to stick around for a bit. But you can't just do one event and go home and expect that you're going to make any kind of dent. But to be clear,
Right.
we didn't think we were going to be there that long. We stayed a couple of months, and what we effectively did down there was we got the party. Uh, we got the whole nation, not the party. Uh, the party eventually came in and adopted our language, and so did the Obama campaign. But ultimately, we got this country off those stupid Tea Party talking points from 2010. We got the country focused on the real issue. We changed the conversation and enabled folks to uh, push forward with a for example, Fight for 15. You see what they're doing, fantastic work, and you see the wages raising in cities across the country. That doesn't happen if we don't change the conversation first. President Obama probably doesn't get reelected if we're still stuck on those Tea Party talking points. He used our language during the campaign. I think, it would have been a nightmare if Mitt Romney had controlled both houses the past few years. Mr. Bain Capital, Mr. Wall Street, but we're looking at a bigger nightmare right now with Donald Trump in the office. We knew that he had a history of screwing people over, but at the same time, we didn't necessarily think that he was this big a liar that he was gonna blatantly break every single campaign promise that he made. We didn't expect him to fill the swamp the way he full of shit, but we didn't think that it was going to be this bad, or at least
Well,
I didn't.
it's interesting you say this because um, the idea of the message, the focus on income inequality, about people being left behind, as opposed to the deficit, which was the Tea Party, and the debt, which was the Tea Party language. Clearly, Trump capitalized on this message as well and ran a campaign that was very highly focused on this inequality story and very much not focused on the debt and the deficit, although he talked about the debt, but it wasn't the focus. And people bought that, and yet now I think we're starting to see a different kind of administration than what he campaigned on.
I think one of the big reasons why um, he took states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I mean, if he did indeed take those states, I mean, clearly he lost the popular vote. I mean, it shouldn't have even been close. Uh, I think Hillary Clinton um, should have been out there talking about her narrative and the progressive issues and laying out her plan for the economy and what she wanted to do for people. I mean, for a full month after the convention, she wasn't active, this five rallies a day, and she was doing one a week. So I don't feel like enough people got to hear what her plan was. And, you're just not going to win elections if you're targeting persuadable voters 3 weeks out. You need to have a 50 state plan. You need to be coordinating with all of our progressive coalition on the ground. That's all the community organizations. That is all of the uh, big national organizations. Obama had that back in 2007. Everybody was lock and step, and for some reason, just the lack of coordination with labor locals and other organizations on the ground, our traditional allies. It didn't happen, the way it has in the past. And there are a number of other issues I think, hurt us. For one, who watches the 6 p.m. nightly news anymore? I don't know anybody under 60 that does. People are getting their info online, right?
Right.
So they spent $1 billion on TV ads that nobody saw. Um, I think not giving social media as much attention as it should have been given was also a problem. Clearly, she was the better candidate. Uh, but there were some mistakes I feel that were made, and I want to be careful just not to blame our people and citizens around the country. I just think there were some errors that were made, and I think in the future we can do a whole lot better.
I hear you on that. Let me ask you, I know we want to talk about organizing and movement, but it seems to me that your criticism, which I share, of the Clinton campaign of being too fixated on why Trump is bad and not focused enough on the positive agenda that she was promoting. Oh, no, I've lost my connection. Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Um, okay, all right. That dichotomy where she was focused more on bashing Trump and less on what she was going to do to make the America a better place. Isn't that what's going on right now? Isn't that what the Democrats are doing in government now? Aren't they all fixated on what's so bad about the Trump administration and not offering an alternative?
I think you need a combination to be successful. I think we did the counter stuff, messaging really well. I think in terms of what's happening right now, the Democratic Party is in flux. We're soon going to have a new chairperson. I think that'll be helpful. I think it's important. I think there's a narrative being framed around what Trump knew and how close his ties are to Russia. It's super important, but on the same token, at some point here in the near future, we've come up with a platform talking about what we need and and what we're going to try to give Americans, uh, you know, moving forward. And,
Yeah.
and I think it's really critical that, we're also looking at Trump's enablers who sit in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Senate. I think they're fair game. I love what folks are doing to target these guys on the ground. These are regular folks coming out of their homes who are upset. It's not just Democrats. There are a lot of Republicans who are coming out and independents. Just a lot of people who aren't looking at this from a party perspective. They're pissed.
Right.
30 million people could potentially be left without health insurance. Not 20, but it's actually 30 to be able to do whatever the hell they want. Um, I can go down the list and it's scary, and he
Yeah.
doesn't have a mandate. I mean, we saw the day after his sparsely attended inauguration, we saw the amount of people that were in D.C. and it didn't happen just in Washington. There were major marches all over the country. That was a major statement after his inauguration that he doesn't have a mandate. He lost a popular vote, and we turned out at least 4 times as many people to the Women's March the day after the inauguration. I think it's telling. I think people are going to continue to show up and hold enabler. They're going to hold their feet to the ground, and they're going to hold Trump's feet to the ground. The guy's got a glass jaw, and I would just say to everybody, keep it coming.
So let's go back a little bit to sort of the original points we were discussing, back to Occupy Wall Street, but also how it applies to the Women's March and in general the idea of, you start something and you have to keep it going, and you don't necessarily know if what you start when you start is going to actually get the traction that you think that you hope it's going to get, and this intersection of the online offline, which I think is a crucial element towards getting that ongoing momentum. So let's start with Occupy Wall Street in particular. What did you do before people showed up at the park?
Yeah.
To get things set up? What did you do to invite people? What did you set up on social media? Did you set up web pages? Did you set up Facebook pages? What was the logistics of all that?
I mean, we had 6 months to prepare.
Really? 6 months?
It was done primarily on social media. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were meeting. Our first meeting was in Tompkins Square Park, so we were coordinating this stuff well in advance, and one of the reasons why we were so successful is we were nonviolent and we didn't destroy any property. Um, you know, it all comes down to peaceful resistance. And we're going to
Right.
continue to talk about Occupy Wall Street, but I want to go back to the
Please.
protests. There were people breaking windows at the inauguration, and that shit is unacceptable. And
Right.
thank goodness that we turned out over 1 million people the next day and made our statement. We didn't we did not condone that bullshit when Occupy Wall Street was happening. And oftentimes we made sure that we had enough people in the crowd, enough marshals, enough people, kind of keeping an eye on that, making sure that, folks who wanted to cover their faces and act like hooligans, weren't able to form what they call black blocs. We'd have people deliberately, get in between, groups of these people so they couldn't, form their own marches or take over our march.
Interesting.
Or if they wanted to form their own march, it's a free country, but you're not going to form that
somewhere
out of
else.
ours.
Right,
You
right,
know,
totally.
we just didn't we didn't go do that somewhere else. And oftentimes if somebody would do something stupid in another part of the country, if it wasn't something that was in solidarity with what we were doing, and it wasn't based on those ideals, we'd issue a statement to the press and say that that had nothing to. You're not showing solidarity with that, and those weren't our people. Unfortunately, when things happen, outside of your vicinity, you can't necessarily control everything, but it needs to be made clear when people are organizing any kind of event like this that you just don't condone that stuff, and you need to, you really need to police yourselves.
Yeah, certainly we saw, some of these challenges with regard to keeping it peaceful at the Dakota Access
Did I lose
Pipeline
you?
protection. I'm still here. Are you there? We had similar issues with, trying to keep the violence away
Yep,
from the
I'm here.
protection actions at the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was really key. And there was all that. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of compare and contrast and get your thoughts on was the sort of the distributed aspects of some of these protests, some of these events. Occupy Wall Street started in one place, and then there was an emergence over time of a lot of Facebook pages: Occupy Kansas, Occupy Seattle, Occupy Washington. There were encampments in various different places.
Yeah.
A lot of them were showing solidarity with Occupy Wall Street. Some of them, I think you mentioned, were trying to push different agendas. That's one model where it sort of happens after the fact, whereas the Women's March happened simultaneously and was organized to happen simultaneously. Talk a little bit about sort of how things happened for the Occupy Wall Street movement, and to what extent that informed some of the things that you think happened in the Women's March.
I mean, we sent people to Boston, we sent people to Chicago and Miami and Los Angeles. We set up Facebook pages. We connected to labor. You know, those guys, the folks at the AFL and SCIU were so good to us. They blasted their members, move on, encourage people to come. You know, anybody that was affected by economic and income inequality, and that's pretty much everybody but the 1% of the 1%, right? Uh,
Right.
uh, anybody that has been affected by that, everybody knows somebody who's lost a home. Everybody knows somebody, who lost their job. Everybody knows somebody who is drowning in student debt. So, the whole country really got behind it. But we were very careful. We allies, and they got the word out. And, in terms of the Women's March, I just think, you had a group of friends that put up a Facebook page. It was completely organic. Before you know it, 100,000 people RSVP'd, and they had some organizers from New York reach out to them and help them out, and help push the ball further ahead, and make some institutional connections, and they got some endorsements, and they found some funding to set up a stage and everything, and that was great. But to be very clear, the co-chairs didn't sign on until later on. I think, with these organic things, you really need to have that organic base. You have to show that it's coming from the people before
Right.
you get the institutions involved. Otherwise, it's the oh, it's the it's the march, or or the Planned Parenthood march, and that's okay. A lot of people show up to that, but when you can,
Right.
get other folks to, kind of come on, and so I think, that was our model. It looks like that's kind of how things ended up, shaping up in New York. There's some other, details, and there's some things that I won't talk about because I don't want the other side to know how we're organizing these things. I
Right.
think we have a pretty good advantage there in terms of being able to put people on the ground. But I
Well, let
think you
me
got to
ask
start.
about this. Yeah, so I really like your point about how it's really important to get these things started organically, and then the sponsors come in, and then the support comes in, and then the institutional partners come in, and I think that's really important. But despite that, no matter how it's organized, the opposition always seems to accuse the progressive movement of, those people were all paid to be there by George Soros. It's the classic line, right? All paid to be there by the AFL, all paid to be there by somebody. And it's clearly not
Yeah,
true. But
yeah.
yet they
Listen,
helped.
you
Yeah.
cannot pay. Nobody's paying millions of people to show up at a
I
women's
know, I know.
march.
Right. But that didn't
That's
stop them from making the accusation.
sure, and people don't buy it. It's like you compare the two photographs of his inauguration to the amount of people that were at the women's march the following day. It's asinine. I mean, we could say the same thing, and it's actually true in this case about Americans for Prosperity and the Koch brothers, bussing everybody around and paying them to show up at these, engagements in different parts of the country. Uh, Look, people who work
Are you
these.
suggesting are you suggesting that somebody paid Are you suggesting that somebody paid for the people to attend Trump rallies?
Um, I'm not suggesting that, but it's kind of interesting. At a lot of these Trump rallies, you had people coming from hundreds of miles away. A lot of these folks uh, weren't necessarily from that community.
Right. It's kind of like a Grateful Dead tour. Uh-oh. Well, it seems that you've locked up on my screen. Um, so oh, we've lost him for a moment. Let me see if I can get him back up. I'll try to bring Aaron back up here, and it looks like we may have lost his camera. Well, so as we were talking about here, one of the big challenges is that even in organic movements, these large organically instigated turnouts for these protests, and there's always going to be somebody out there that, oh, they were all paid to be there. Now, the first thing you have to do is, well, where's your evidence, and is your evidence simply an example of one guy that said he paid to bus in one busload of people, and therefore you're going to judge and conclude that 1 million people were paid to be there? I think Aaron makes a really strong point that that it's just not feasible to be able to. It's just not within. It doesn't pass the smell test to say that that there were millions of people across the country at the Women's March, and that they were all paid to be there. That just makes no sense. People were going to local marches in cities all around the country, and similarly during the Occupy Wall Street movement, there were camps set up all around the country. These people were not paid to be there. These people were they were zealots, they were activists, they were committed. Um, so I think that's really, really, really powerful stuff. So we seem to have lost Aaron for the moment, and hopefully he will come back. Uh, and in the interim, I want to basically. Okay, it looks like we have Ben will be joining us shortly, which is always a pleasure. While we're waiting for Aaron to try to reconnect and see where we can go from there, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening in the news lately. For me, I think one of the big challenges is, everybody always talks about how social media has been the great asset of the Trump campaign and the Trump administration, that he is the master of Twitter and seems to be using social media in such powerful ways. But I want to point out a few things that suggest that maybe it's not as good a thing for the Trump administration and for Trump himself to be using social media quite the way that he's been using. And I'll emphasize a couple of things that have seemed to be examples of social media turning around to bite the president on the ass. Number one, think about this: the court cases in Seattle and then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals regarding the immigration ban. Was able to make the judgment that even though the executive order didn't say Muslim ban in it, that Trump's tweets and speeches referring to what he was planning to do talked about it as if it was a Muslim ban. And using those words in social media was a documentation that the courts used as his intent with regard to the actual letter of the executive order. That's a very serious issue because it suggests that he's tweeting stuff, and he's in some cases tweeting stuff rather furiously and not necessarily with a lot of thought. And as we start to litigate the Trump administration, as states and advocacy organizations and localities find damage as a result of Trump policies and sue the administration, we're going to start to find that the courts will have this rich body of content that the president has been pushing out that is that will shape the interpretation of the policies that he is promulgating. And this is going to repeatedly, I think, affect his ability to succeed, or rather it'll lead to a lot of failure in the courts. This is a big problem, and I find it very, very interesting to see that happening. Secondly, Trump's sense of theatrics makes him more likely to do things in front of other people who can take photos and share them on social media in inappropriate places. So, for example, the dinner at Mar-a-Lago where he was having dinner with the Prime Minister of Japan, and the North Korean missile launch what happens. Next thing you know, he's having these changes. Hey, welcome back, Aaron. Let me just finish this thought. He's having these meetings and briefings about a national security issue with onlookers taking photos and posting them on Facebook. These are really challenging things, and I think we really need to keep an eye on that. So with that interlude, welcome back, Aaron. Can you hear me?
Thanks. I hear you well. Where did you lose me?
We were talking about the impossibility of paying millions of people to show up to marches across the country.
Right, and I just want to add one more thing. People are hurting, and there are folks all over the country that are voting against their interests because they're not informed, and I think
misinformed,
or they're disinformed, and I think mainstream media has played a big role in that. I mean, if you go back to weapons of mass destruction during the Iraq War, the push to get into that. There's the war on drugs. There's It happens on social media as well. You had Pizzagate and some other things, but I think what we have the ability to do, and more people are paying attention to what's happening online than they do with mainstream media, is we can inform people and let them know what's really happening. I mean, I see some Facebook pages out there that are getting more attention than CNN and Fox and NBC and all the major networks combined. I think it's critically important that the alternative press on social media play it straight, and I think we need to call out folks that are pushing fake news. But just wanted to get back to what I said about who was going to these events on the Trump side. I mean, I would hear some crazy things waiting in line, and you know a lot of those people, they're good people. They're Americans. They're our brothers and sisters, and they're not racist. But there was a cattle call, and a lot of these folks, affiliated with white supremacist groups, the KKK and whatnot, they would show up. You could see the tattoos on their arms. They would use racist words describing people, in line, and it was definitely a cattle call. You'd have people coming from all over the country because this is where a lot of these other folks were meeting up. So that was unfortunate. But a lot of those folks just wanted to hear what he had to say, and I want to be very careful that all Trump supporters are not labeled as racist, because that's just not true. Uh, but
Yeah,
we
I
have
mean, this is a very. I think that's a very important point. I think you're making a very important point because, and it's true on both sides of the aisle. I think that there are clearly people at the fringes on the right and the left, different styles, different patterns of behavior, and not equivalent, I would say, but certainly their behavior is not typical of the mainstream of the left or the mainstream of the right. There are a lot of conservative people in this country that are just decent people that have conservative values, and there are a lot of liberals in this country that have liberal values, but they're decent people with liberal values. And then there are smaller pockets on both sides of people who just want to cause problems. The black bloc groups that you were mentioning earlier on the left, the KKK, the alt-right, the neo-Nazis on the right, and the challenge is that they are they're squeaky wheels, man. They get the press, they get the exposure because they're so out there and they're so in your face, and they're doing things that are so antithetical to mainstream life that they get elevated in the media. And as you say, the danger of painting everybody who supports Trump as being from that fringe, or everybody who supports the Democrats as being from the left fringe. This is just not true. And the vast majority of Americans are just ordinary people, people that you would have a beer with, and sometimes, hopefully sometimes, and hopefully more often than we seem to think, people that you don't necessarily agree with on politics, you can still have a meal and a beer with them because they are a decent person.
Yeah, and I will also say, you get these types that show up, and they're pretty easy to identify, and because of that, it's pretty easy to kind of put the brakes on that crap. But you get these folks that show up; they're not conservatives, they're not progressives. They just want to mess things up. They see a crowd of people and they think, "Whoa, we can come in here and we can put our people at the front of the march and have it go all over the place, and maybe we can get a bunch of these people to get off and riot." And it's always a small group of them, right, that tries to
Right.
get a large group to kind of follow along. If you can identify them, you can kind of kick them out of the way. They're cancer. They're a parasite. And one of the things I think we're getting better at doing on the left is kicking them out of our meetings, not giving them a platform. They don't care about us. They don't care about the other side. All they want to do is cause trouble because they get a rush and they think it's funny.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your ideas on using social media to sustain offline action and to generate new offline action later on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, getting back to Occupy Wall Street, the Women's March, and some of these other movements and events, like Black Lives Matter, it all starts out with a Facebook page. It's these things are not being organized in the traditional manner. I still think it's important to jump on the phone with people and look them in the eye, but and I don't necessarily want to get into all the details about how we make things go viral online and who all we're talking to. But to be clear, you want to make something pop. You want to get people to turn out, and you want them to do it quick. You got to take to Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah. Well, the story I always like to bring back in this is, we think back to the Arab Spring and the uprising against Mubarak in Egypt. Before there were people in Tahrir Square, and like, understand, for years there had always been protests in Tahrir Square, but there was a Facebook page called "We Are All El Shahid," which had 1.5 million likes to the page and 970,000 RSVPs to show up to protest in the square. And that happened before they showed up, and the next thing you know, there's 1 million people in the square. So I think it's really important. I also think it's really important that after it's over, that these social network platforms are great ways to keep people connected to each other and to help organize online activities as well as the next set of offline activities.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to organize something these days simply by reaching out to somebody you have a contact with at one of the news stations. Um, you know, Back in the day, somebody would go to all three networks and give you a plug. It was usually pretty expensive, and if you didn't have to spend any money on it, you just you had to know somebody, and those days are over. I mean, uh, and look, getting back to social media, one of the things we don't want to see happen is have all of us be branded as fake news and controlled by mainstream media companies because if these guys take over the internet, it's going to be Fox, NBC, CBS, ABC, and CNN getting in a room together and deciding who gets elected. You remember back in the days when the head honchos at all the before CNN, all four major news networks made those decisions, and it sucked. And we don't want to go back to that, and we don't want to allow these guys to brand us all as fake news, especially when they're the ones that pioneered this phenomena. I mean, frankly, if you really think about it, I'm sure you turned into Fox or CNN during the election, and your stomach turned just listening to these pundits of poop, spinning their it was 24 hours a day. It was nonstop. It was the same crew, the same circus, and it's terrible. I mean, it's super important that not only are we organizing events online, that we're pushing messaging, and we're telling people what's really going on. If we lose that, we're in big trouble.
Yeah, I think you point to something about the news that I think is, or the news networks, that I think really needs to be unpacked a little bit, because the pundits are not the news broadcasters. The pundits are opinion people, right? And we've lost track in terms of how the news is presented. our ability to differentiate between what are the news broadcasts and what are the opinion broadcasts. For example, Fox News itself, the entire Fox News company is actually part of Rupert Murdoch's entertainment company and not part of his news company, which includes the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post and his book publishing, right? Second, even within Fox News, there is a news division led by Shepard Smith, and then is an entertainment division which includes Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, all the evening talk shows. They're not news shows. They're not held to journalistic ethics. They're not required to follow up on journalistic ethics. That's the reason why when Keith Olbermann donated money to a political candidate while he was a news anchor at MSNBC, he got fired. And why Sean Hannity, when he donated money to a political candidate when he had his show, while he had his show on Fox, was not fired, because he was not a news anchor. He was a host of an entertainment show. And people don't get that. So this idea of being able to differentiate and decipher, is this news or is this crap, is not there. Second, I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the news media gets sort of snookered by government sources. So the whole WMD in Iraq was, a full frontal assault by the Bush administration to pitch the news media that this was true, and there was some failings on the part of the news media to verify this. I did a webinar yesterday on weaponizing social media for Johns Hopkins, and the question came, why is fake news happening? What's this whole phenomenon? What's going on here? And part of the challenge is that the news media, because of social media, has been sort of pressured into this: get the news first, and sometimes not right as a result. So that's one aspect of it. Second, social media and online media has gutted the ability of the news media to be profitable. And so as a result, they've let go a lot of senior reporters, and they have a lot of young reporters who, as I say, smart, capable, and will become amazing journalists later on, but still a little green and not as good at doing the investigation as their senior colleagues who no longer have jobs would have done. And plus they have this extra pressure to get it first. And I think in that backdrop, you have a situation where the news media is easily co-opted by false news. But that is different from fake news, which is outlets that are deliberately trying to mislead you. And I think that it's important to keep that discussion separate, that there are failings in the news media of making it more likely that they get things wrong, but that is very different from fake news, which is a deliberate disinformation effort by a company to disinform people.
And make no mistake, these corporate media companies, want our viewers. They want our advertising money. A lot of these online sites are starting to make money, and whatever they can do to discredit it, to make it go away, so they can reclaim, what they did in their glory days. They're going to do. So yeah. I see a real push from these corporate media folks to try to label anything online as fake. And it'd be one thing if they if their hands were clean, but we know they're not, and they're not the ones that should be going out and talking about what fake news is and what isn't, especially when you have Kellyanne Conway and ilk like her on your shows spreading bullshit.
Yeah. Well, it's a big challenge when, the vice president can't come on your show today. Will you take Kellyanne Conway? No. CNN did say no for a day. That was good. But to be honest, I've been advocating that, if the White House spokesperson refuses to answer questions, then they aren't participating in interviews, so you shouldn't have them on the show to do interviews, and right. And that's just the bottom line. There's a lot of problems here going on in the news media, and I think you identify the corporate drive to discredit upstarts as fake news. You have the political motivation of the White House to discredit any critical news as fake news. You have the pressures from social media that create more mistakes. You have the pressures of declining revenues that gut the capacity to do good investigative journalism. These are all, it's like a perfect storm of problems. And the big challenge is that the large percentage of Americans and people in general, need to bone up on their media and information literacy skills, because it's getting harder and harder to differentiate correct news, incorrect news, and fake news from each other.
It's a big problem.
Yeah, yeah. So part of the challenge, I think, when you're organizing and you're working with these online communities, is not only to mobilize them to a viewpoint, but it's also to teach them how to be critical consumers of information, because you have to compete with disinformation from the other side, and you also have to compete with real information from the other side. So you have to deal with these things. And so, how do you wrap together both sort of a mobilization message and a skill, and improving your skills kind of imperative?
I mean, I think the bottom line is we just want to give people the information, and if they like it, they're going to show up.
Right.
We want to, we're not interested in being part of the brainwashing industry. We're not taking that advertising approach. If you have a good idea, and it's organized, people will show up. They always do, especially if it's something that affects them.
Yeah.
So I think,
But you still
to
have to
answer your
protect
other,
yourself against
right.
criticisms of being.
Oh, well, people are always going to try to spread bullshit. But look, the bottom line is, people show up, and you stay connected, and you have your meetings and you
Yeah.
have your trainings. But, you got no business being an organizer if you organize an event and then you don't stay in touch with the people. These people are showing up
Right.
because
Right.
they want to change things. They want to be a part of something. You just don't put something together that doesn't have something that they're able to do to participate in the end.
Yeah. I think that's really the most important thing, is that these are never one-offs, and they never should be. These are about changing the conversation for the long haul. And
Not
and as I
not
said,
not the one.
Occupy Wall Street did change the conversation still.
And these are not one-offs that I'm involved in. But I do see a lot of one-offs that happen. It's all the time, and they're never going to work because you're not following through and you're not doing something sustainable. Um,
Right.
and it doesn't have uh, an ask. And look, the other thing is you gotta have the press. You gotta have folks with a large presence on social media to document this sort of thing, because you do an event and it gets no attention, it didn't happen. Because you're not just sharing this with
Right.
the attendees. I mean, look, there were millions of people who went to the women's marches around the country, but there were millions more who watched that unfold on TV, and they felt like they were part of it too. So
Yes.
you gotta connect with that
Right.
audience.
And millions more still who took place on social media.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. This has been really spot on. I think it's really important to understand how movements get off the ground and how they percolate up and then become organized and then capture the hearts and minds and imaginations of the public, and ultimately take over party movement, party organizations. I think it's really important to recognize that political parties are not the birthplace of movements. They are taken over by movements, and we've seen that a few times in our lifetime already.
The
So thank
party
you very
is
much,
there.
Aaron. And
Oh,
yes,
the party is there to serve us. We're not here to serve the party. And thank you for
exactly.
having me.
And
Appreciate.
we'll be in touch and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
So that's the we're going to wrap up the show for today. I just want to say that it's really important. I want to make sure that everybody understands that message, that regardless of what you do when it comes to organizing events, whether it be large-scale movement attempts, creates a movement style events, or even just a small event to push your organization, your campaign, your candidacy, your issue, that the bottom line is that you have to be in it for the long haul. You have to use all the tools at your disposal, online and offline, to promote the event. You have to use those tools to amplify the event while it's taking place, and you have to use them to sustain that conversation moving forward after the event ends and through all the subsequent events. Because if you just do things as one-off, you simply will not have the opportunity to make substantive change in the world around you, which I think is the reason why we all want to participate in these events. And so with that, it's another week of the Dr. DigiPol show. Just a heads up, we will not be on the air next week. We will return again the week after. That'll be my birthday week, so we're looking forward to that. In the meantime, we'll do a little head bopping on the way out, and we'll see you soon on the Dr. DigiPol show.